As usual, we are not here to promote any certain person. These lovely people have decided to take of their time just to share with us. This is not a marketing. We have not roped you in with popcorn and coffee for a marketing situation. It is just for information, to know more about how to plan ahead, what some of your choices are, some of the things you can pre-plan, prepay. We're going to have someone here in a couple weeks for Medicare, Medicaid, senior health. So it's just, we always feel, obviously, if you're informed, then you can make better decisions for yourself. And you seriously want to make those decisions before your children have to make them for you. Because both times with both my parents, it has been left to my brother and Steve and I. And if they hadn't sat us down 9 months before my dad had a hemorrhagic stroke and told us, this is where the stuff is, this is what we want done, this is how we want things to go, we would have been in shock and also clueless. It's bad enough to be in shock, but you want to be in informed shock when you're the spouse or you're the children. There's nothing that says tomorrow is promised to us. And there's also nothing that says that you aren't going to go together. When you're a couple in here, you don't know that you're going to go separately. It's very rare, but it can happen, right? And you've got to remember, last year we celebrated the life of someone who was 20, and we celebrated the life of someone who was 43. So that's why you're never too young. We're all young here. We're all whatever young we want to be. But we want to make these decisions, and we want to be, as a church, then we can also be supportive of each other, right? And so I would like to open with prayer, as I do. Father God, we are always so thankful for the opportunity to gather together, to have our encouragement and our fellowship, but also to learn from someone who knows more than us. So bless Tim for being here. We appreciate him so much for offering his time so that we can be better informed about how to make great decisions for ourselves and for our families. And so, Lord, just pour out your Spirit upon this time together, that we would open our ears to hear what we need to hear, and that we would be encouraged and lifted up and reminded that for us planning for these next months, years ahead, decades, whatever it may be, and also then planning for eternal life is never an ending. It's just a beginning with you. And we are so thankful for that, Lord. So we lift up this time to you and just thank you for blessing us with Tim. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is attorney Tim O'Sullivan. He does estate planning as well as elder care. He's agreed to share with us about, he's also an adjunct professor at Washburn Law School. So he knows his stuff. He's going to go through his presentation, but he's also willing to stay a bit later and answer questions if you have questions afterwards. But one of his goals by presenting to us tonight is because far too often people's bank accounts, people's homes, that sort of stuff end up in probate. And there's a huge rift between children, plural, lots of children, you never know. If you get it all legal and in writing, it's just clearer and better for everybody. So that's why we've invited him to come along. And just thank you so much, Tim. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pastor Susan. When she invited me to come here, I didn't realize it would be a real hot topic tonight, but hotter than I thought. Wow, it's hot out there. I'm going to go through estate planning. We're going to just tell you what the truth is of all these things, and we lawyers should tell our clients what is best. I don't recommend. You tell the pros and cons, let your clients decide. Now, just because they wouldn't pick what I would pick is irrelevant. It needs to be best for the client. And we have a duty, an ethical duty, to tell clients the true pros and cons of one versus another. And even if it costs us money, and avoiding probate costs us money, but we should be talking to clients about that. But we're going to talk about avoiding probate It's not going to be probably the number one goal and shouldn't be for reasons we're going to talk about, but we're going to go through that. These quotes I have up here, I've kind of assembled those over the years. They all have some relevance to estate planning. Cost of doing nothing is not nothing. The second one I really like, ignorance may be bliss, but it can be expensive. And H.L. Mencken, that was a quote, for every complex situation, there's always a simple solution, but it's usually wrong. You can't have a complex situation and have a simple solution. And there's hardly anything simple about estate planning. There's all the little nuances that most clients are not aware of. They need to be aware of when they do the estate plan, or we lawyers need to know that on their behalf. And that gets to the next thing. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. You want to cover everything in your documents. If you don't cover it, it's like an insurance policy. I have tornado insurance in my house here in Wichita. I know Tornado Alley's moved east, maybe not east of Andover, but east of here. And I had an insurance adjuster tell me what the odds of a tornado hitting my house in Wichita, it's less now probably because it's moved away from here a little bit, over an entire lifetime of somebody living in Wichita, the odds of a tornado hitting someone's house, what do you think that is, or high wind, damaging or seriously destroying it? What would you say? How much was it?
5%?
No, about 1/4%, 400 to 1. That's not going to happen. Why do I have that tornado insurance? What if I'm one of those 400? Yeah. You know, so I just, when you do estate planning, if you have a comprehensive plan, there'll be a lot of stuff that have maybe no application to you now, but could later. And if you don't, it's better, the old adage, it's better to have it and not need it, and need it, not have it. So you're going to see that, and that's what we try to cover in documents. May not cover them now, but it's no solace to clients to say, well, that was only 1 in 400, so we didn't worry about that. You know, you try to cover about everything you can possibly think of, especially we get to powers of attorney to make sure they cover. A lot of things are just left out of powers of attorney, particularly if you get them off the internet, because they don't cover Kansas law usually, for reasons we'll go into. So it should be comprehensive. That I will tell clients. The postmortem squabblings and contests of human condition have made a will the least secure of all human dealings. Well, that's true. You never know people until you've been through it, shared an estate with them. That is really true. And families underestimate the risk of disharmony in their own families. It's not going to happen. Well, I can tell you it happens a lot. And when that happens, it usually damages the most valuable asset the clients have, family harmony. And it can run up a lot of money at the same time. Good for lawyers, bad for clients. He who represents himself has a fool for a client, Abraham Lincoln. You've probably heard that one before. Why? Because we have a conflict of interest. We cannot be objective about our own situation. So the same, I'm going to be talking about having children serve as fiduciaries of a parent's estate. Extremely high-risk situation. We'll go through that in a little bit. Why? Because they have a conflict of interest. And sometimes they have grudges with siblings that complicates the situation. So they can't be objective about managing an estate. You got a conflict of interest. Let me see if one others I can pick out here. Conflict is inevitable, combat is optional. When you design an estate plan, you don't want fights and feuds that get out in the open. Now, one thing Kansas has that passed this about 5 years ago, you can put mediation and arbitration provisions in trust now, and they're enforceable. So if there's a conflict between children, that's not going to be resolved by lawsuits. They go through mediation. Mediation settles about 70% of squabbles in families. 70%. If that doesn't get you to binding arbitration, don't sue a sibling. And what you do is you put some teeth on it. If they sue instead of going through mediation arbitration, your share's cut by 50%. That's usually enough to get them to want to mediate. A stick, not just a carrot, but a stick. It's not me who can't keep a secret, it's the people I tell. Another Abraham Lincoln quote. So if you're telling a family member, for example, don't tell your brother or sister this, you know, if I'm going to tell you about it, you know it's going to come out. Let's see what else I got there. Oh, Will Rogers, that's good. Good judgment comes from experience, and a lot of that comes from bad judgment. That's very true. This is one I use all the time. Tie things down, don't tie them up. You make your documents flexible to deal with different situations. You don't want to be stuck and can't change it. Okay. Oh, that's an Oscar Wilde quote. I guess he didn't have any money. He didn't have money left when he died. I'll have to die beyond my means. Winston Churchill, taxes were invented by governments to prevent citizens from hoarding money. And Arthur Godfrey years ago, I'm proud of paying taxes. The only thing is I'm be just as proud for half the money. Another good one. Let's see if there's anything I want to cover there. Well, I think you can read those too as well. Unfortunately, it didn't come out quite as well on the materials here as I hoped. They're a little too small to read. This is about inheritances. That was a true New York will. I love the first one. I bequeath my son the right to earn a living. Up to this point, the pleasure's been all mine. Inheritance is misguided affection. Inherited money is certain to death as certain a death to ambition as cocaine is to morality. Vanderbilt. And Warren Buffett, he wants to give his children enough so they can do anything, but not so much they can do nothing, not work, etc. But these are things to think about in an estate plan. They all have to have application. Your estate plan, how you're leaving money to family members. Of course, these people had a lot of money to leave, right? They had plenty. This has to do with, this is the top, I did an article for Marquette Law School in '07. It's on the internet about family harmony, and I call it resting in pieces, and how to avoid fights and feuds. We'll talk about that in a little bit, so that's what that's all about. Now let's go through some of the basic stuff. Picking the wrong probate avoidance device. Is probate the number one goal? Should be? No, no. You want to get your property who you want it to go to, when you want it to get there, with the least amount of costs and also least amount of family disharmony. Avoiding probate is not the number one goal. It shouldn't be, because some of these devices to avoid probate create all kinds of other problems, particularly if they're not used right. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So when I do estate plans, I have a list of priorities. Family harmony is usually number one. Saving taxes, administrative costs. Probate's the last priority. It's good to avoid probate, but it's not if you don't accomplish all these other goals as well. Now, what goes through probate? Probate is a way to figure out who owns property, who's the next owner of property when someone dies owning property. And it means they have not put any property in. The ways to avoid probate are joint tenancy, beneficiary designations, and revocable trusts. Those are the three ways. Unless you want to give your property away to your kids while you're living and you don't have anything. But those are the devices that will avoid probate. Now, joint tenancy has a right to survivorship feature. So when one joint tenant dies, the other one's the owner. How do you prove that? Death certificate. So husband and wife own a house in joint tenancy. Husband dies. Wife files a death certificate at the Register of Deeds. She owns the property. If she puts the house up for sale right after she files that death certificate, title insurance company's going to check with the Register of Deeds. They're going to see joint tenancy. They're going to see a death certificate of the husband. They'll take a deed from her. Does that make sense? That's why joint tenancy avoids probate. The next owner is the spouse. But I have clients come in and say, well, we have our house in joint tenancy, and I need to get down to the courthouse and take my husband's name off the deed. What do you go, white out? What's the, racers? No, a death certificate. They don't take anybody's. The deed's been filed. It just shows that one of them is deceased. You don't go in and erase names off deeds. Get away with it, at least. Second way is with beneficiary designations. We're talking about life insurance. It started out many years ago. You could only put beneficiaries in life insurance, retirement plans, IRAs. The law didn't allow any other beneficiary in any other type of asset. Then in 1980, they changed the law and says you can put it on bank accounts, mutual funds, bank accounts, credit union accounts, and also savings and loans, all three. They're called POD. Ever heard of POD accounts, payable on death? They're called POD because they're paying cash. Those are all cash accounts with a beneficiary on them. Then in 1994, I know this, I teach this all the time, 1994, it's not important for you to remember the dates of these, but 1994 they changed, so that was 1980 for POD. 1994 they changed it so you could put on stocks and mutual funds. You hear of TOD or transfer on death? You're transferring the ownership. That's why it's not a payable. It's transferring TOD. So you can have a mutual fund, you can name a beneficiary on it. All you have to do is show you survived the owner and it's your property if you're the beneficiary. That's just like joint tenancy, death certificate, it's yours if you survive. What happens a lot of times is people don't have contingent beneficiaries on those. That person dies, now what happens? It's going to go through probate because there's no eligible beneficiary. Then in 1997, they changed the law again so you could put it on motor vehicles and real estate, transfer on death deeds. You can sign those. Now, transfer on death deeds have to be filed during lifetime. You can't do a TOD deed, give somebody, they can file it after your death. It's invalid. It has to be filed of record while you're living. But you're transferring ownership just like you are with mutual funds. You're transferring title, or TOD. Now, so if someone dies, they don't have the last way, well, let's get one more, the revocable trust. If you have a revocable trust, a living trust, revocable living trust, I don't care what you call it, it's the same thing. It's an entity that can own assets, that provides what happens when you're living and the assets in there, and usually the people set it up, they're their own trustees, they can do whatever they want during their lifetime. If they become disabled, it provides for another trustee to come in and manage the trust for them. At date of death, if they haven't come in before, they come at date of death and come on, pay the bills, distribute the assets according to the terms of the trust. We know who the next owner is because when the person dies, who's the owner? The trust is, right? And the trust decides, pay the bills, and who gets this property. So if they convey a deed to a child under the terms of the trust, they get the property. Because it was owned by the trust deeds it out, and then the child owns it at that point in time. So those all provide for who the next owner is without probate. But those are the only three devices that will do it. So if someone dies, not a joint tenant, no beneficiary, not owned by a trust, it's probate. And you go through probate one of two ways, testate or intestate. You ever heard those terms? Last will and testament, you've got a will. Intestate, it's like Prince, died, no will. Intestate. If you have a will, the will is going to provide who the executor is to manage the estate, just like the trustee in a trust, but it's going through probate. It's the executor under a will to manage the estate. And it's pay my bills, file my tax returns. We'll talk about distributing personal effects and all that type of thing, and here's where I want the rest of my property to go under the terms of the will. And so it designates who the next property is under the terms of the will, but a judge has to approve the admission to probate, subject to any challenges, it's invalid. Maybe they didn't have it witnessed correctly, maybe the person wasn't competent, maybe undue influence. There's challenges you can make to wills to show that they're not valid. And you can do that with trust too as well. Not competent, you got to have competency to sign a trust as well. And then once the judge says who owns the property, after you go back, you paid the bills, file accountings with the court, you've given the beneficiaries copies of the will if they want to challenge it, and you have a petition to close out the estate. Judge, this is what I've done all these things that I'm supposed to be doing, pay the bills or file the inventory. Here's what the property's left. We filed the accounting, and we believe as attorneys for the executor, this property goes to this person, in the terms of the will. Now, if any beneficiary of the will doesn't think that goes that way, they could challenge it. Most of the time, it's not challenged because it's a correct interpretation. And once the judge says who owns that property, they own it. They don't need a deed. So if it said the house goes to the spouse under the terms of the will, that's of record who got it. People think you need a deed. You don't need a deed to convey property all the time. If a court says who owns it, they own it. Like if you had eminent domain, they condemn property for the state, and the state now owns it. Well, the court ordered it that way. But you do not need a probate, a will to convey it. Once people think, well, if somebody comes in, I said, well, how'd you get this property? I inherited it. Okay. Through an estate? Yes. Okay. Send me a copy of the journal entry, the final, who said who got this property, to show that you got this property. They got it, they own the property, then they can put it in a trust or whatever else they want to do with it, put a beneficiary on it. But that's what shows who owns it. It's a conveyance. My dad used to run the trust department at the National Bank a long time ago, and he said he could always tell a green auditor. They didn't have a lot of experience. They'd come in and he had like a testamentary trust where they died. And a testamentary trust is a trust that's created under the will. I'm leaving property in trust for minor children. So the judge orders the property transferred into this trust, on the terms of this trust, and it's governed by whoever the trustee of that testamentary trust is. So he would be, if they named the bank as trustee, they were the trustee under the testamentary trust. Auditors would come in and say, "Where's the deed?" He'd laugh at them, There isn't a deed. The judge said the trust owns it, we own it. We'll show you, here's a decree. Does that make sense? Any questions, just raise your hand. I'm going fast, I know that. If anybody wants to get on our website, we've got all kinds of, on our website, all these little areas of special interest. These are all posted areas of special interest. Most everything I'm talking about is on our website as well. What goes through probate, all those different issues. But the more you know, the better off you are, as Pastor Susan was saying. Because if you don't know why this works, you make mistakes easily. So let's talk about the pros and cons of different probate avoidance devices. We're going to talk about mistakes, and some of these mistakes actually I'm going to illustrate right now. If you have property in joint tenancy with someone else that's not your spouse, they're a co-owner. So if that person, like a child, is a joint tenant on a bank account and they get sued, guess who can get that property? The creditor. Because they're a co-owner, anybody can withdraw the money out of a joint tenancy account. People don't realize that. If the whole thing they can withdraw. I had a client years ago, she put her house in joint tenancy with her daughter. Daughter goes through a divorce. She gets a letter from husband's lawyer. Notice that your house is in joint tenancy with your daughter. And wants to know what else she had in joint tenancy with her daughter, because he was going to go after it. She had a half interest. Joint tenancy is presumed to be half owned. But the reason a bank account they can get the whole thing is because anybody is a co-joint on a joint tenant can withdraw the whole amount. So anybody can withdraw the whole amount. So it's not usually a good idea to ever put a joint tenant but a spouse on an account for that reason. Everybody get that? Expose it to anybody that's a joint tenant. And a lot of them go and take the money out. Like maybe the parent becomes disabled, they just withdraw the money. And they can do that. Only takes one signature to do that. Now all of these probate avoidance devices except trusts have property going outright to someone as a joint tenant or a beneficiary. Therein is the potential issue too, problem. If you have a beneficiary designation or a joint tenant, when you die, it goes outright to that person. Now I know you've got somebody coming with Medicaid in a couple of weeks, you indicate that, but think of spouses. If they go into long-term care, goes to spouses, all got to be spent down now before they qualify for Medicaid. We're going to talk about that a little bit. I'm sure you'll get more of that in a couple of weeks. But that is a huge area that most estate plans are very poorly planned for long-term care. I'd say 90% of them. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Because you don't want to have to spend all your assets down to qualify for Medicaid. You might need them later. It's gone, and we don't know what Medicaid is going to provide for in the future. And it's best to save your assets so you can live a little bit better, even if you had to go to long-term care, private rooms, that type of thing. But it all has to be spent down about $2,000 if a surviving spouse gets that outright. Let's talk about one more thing that has to do with Medicaid. You ever heard of state recovery on Medicaid? State of Kansas has recovery against all assets that a single person has at their death left that they paid for Medicaid. They can go against those assets to recovery every dollar they got. That includes joint tenancy, that includes beneficiary designations, and you say, well, Tim, you can call me Tim, how can that be, because you don't qualify for Medicaid unless you get $2,000, right? You've heard that one, right? Well, there's certain assets that are exempt, like a home. That's exempt. They can go and sell off the home to recover what they paid Medicaid. Now, most of the time, you don't want a home owned by someone who's in long-term care, particularly a surviving spouse, because it's going to be vacant usually. You can't get insurance to insure it. And if you sell it, now it turns into cash, now you got to spend the cash down. But even if you didn't have to and you kept state on Medicaid and they paid out, I'm making a number, let's say $80,000 for Medicaid, they can go against that house to recover that when that individual dies. Now the first spouse that owns that, there's no recovery. It's the surviving spouse they go after. They can't recover for Medicaid paid to one spouse if there's a surviving spouse until the surviving spouse passes away. So far okay? We're doing pretty well then. You're competent. Okay. This stuff ain't easy. And when you're talking to people, particularly when people are elderly, and it's difficult anyway, and judging by my students, they have a hard time getting it too. Last time I graded my finals a few months ago. What? Anyway, so but you can understand if we go slow enough about that. But it's not easy. Medicaid is one of the most complicated things to ever plan for. But these probate avoidance devices are not very good for that. Naming it outright to a spouse, long-term care, that, or another one that can happen, it goes outright to a spouse. What if a surviving spouse gets sued? What if they get remarried and go to, now they accept that property claims of a new spouse, let alone get remarried and then give it to a new spouse instead of it gets back to the kids of the couple. You've heard of that happening, I'm sure. Simple things like that do not plan for creditors, spend down, remarriages. They're simple, it just goes outright. So that's the problem with H.L. Mencken. That's a very simple solution, but it's usually wrong if you're trying to plan against creditors, spouses, and Medicaid. So, another problem with joint tenancy is, of course, if something happens to both of you, there is no joint tenant. That's a probate asset. There's no surviving joint tenant. If there's a beneficiary and it goes to a spouse and something happened to both of you, you would need to have a contingent beneficiary. Well, if you have a contingent benefit, it's going to go outright to them too. So let's assume we have a surviving spouse naming all the kids as beneficiaries on everything. 3 kids, I'll just name all my kids as beneficiaries in bank accounts, everything else. Nice and simple. What's the problem? Well, not at the death, because the death certificate, they're going to own it, aren't they? But what happens if they predecease the parent? Now where's it going to go? It's going to go to the other kids, and their kids get disinherited. They don't think about that. They assume their kids are going to survive them, but if they don't, they're disinherited. Like people have a lot of money in IRAs. I've seen that happen. Name all the kids as an IRA, one child dies, and the other kids get the entire IRA, and that share does not go to their kids at all. It goes to the other kids. It goes to surviving beneficiaries is where it goes. And it's pretty hard to put beneficiaries that go to deceased kids, that most of these banks and everything will not take that kind of, well, it goes to these kids, and you don't want to say it goes to their kids in equal shares. They don't want to take that. Why? How do they know who the kids are? All kinds of administrative costs and time to figure out who those kids are. They don't want beneficiary designations like that. So beneficiary designations don't plan very well for alternate beneficiaries. They also don't plan very well for if you're trying to protect kids from third-party claims. Because the property goes outright to children. What happens if they go through a divorce, get sued? You can't have a will that says it's going to my kids and their spouse can't take it. You can't, that does not work. I have people say that. No. When that child owns the assets, it's free and clear. Well, what they can do whatever they want with it. You can't say what they can do with it. The only way that you protect against these things, I'm getting to the point here a little bit, if you want to protect it against anyone, against what they do with the assets or long-term care or lawsuits, you have to leave it in a trust for them. And the only device that will leave in trust and avoid probate is a revocable trust. You put in trust and it stays in trust for my spouse or my kids. And probate is not that expensive. That doesn't mean you ought to pay for it. I have very few clients that want anything to go through probate. My estate's not planning to go through probate either. But it's not because I'm going to save a ton of money. I do it because it's a hell of a lot easier, if I can use that term, Professor. Okay, all right, Pastor Susan. Is that okay? Am I absolved? Okay. It's a lot easier, okay? It's a lot easier, all right. I'll stay away from the adjectives. It's a lot easier to do that, to go through it, because you don't have to go to court, you don't have to file inventories, and it's not a matter of public record as to who owns your property and who it's going to. And a lot of my clients think their friends and neighbors would know way too much already, particularly in smaller communities, not as much in Wichita. And I think some of those people may have told their friends and neighbors they're worth a lot more than they really are. And you got to file an inventory, and they'll find out how much you're really worth. But if you're leaving property in trust for a spouse, for example, and then at the death of the spouse, it's going to go to certain children, different shares, they're going to find out what the surviving spouse's claim share is going to be too, because their will is going to be just a flip, same provisions, just different names. So when you see what the predeceased spouse is doing, they could be pretty sure surviving spouse has the same plan. So they come back and talk to the surviving spouse, they change it, that they get more assets than their brother or sister. That's the kind of stuff you can have. Well, trusts don't have any of that. They're easier, they're private, and you don't have to give copies to anybody except the beneficiaries. So usually in Kansas has a very, let's say, client-friendly uniform trust code. We lobbied a lot in Topeka. I can definitely say that the real property probate trust section of the bar, which I've been involved in for about 30 years now, we proposed legislation that's good for clients. And when that was first proposed, it said you had to give a copy of the trust to every beneficiary currently and everybody who would receive it if that beneficiary died. My clients don't want to do that. They don't want to give their kids, if they're leaving assets in trust for their spouse, they don't want their kids to see copies of the trust. It's none of their business. They're only leaving in trust to protect the spouse from these claims, not to anything else. So why should they have to give copies of that to see what the kids are going to get as the remainder after the trust ends? So that we are one of the few states that does that.
Sir?
Yes, I'm sorry, I need to look over here. Okay, all righty.
Okay, if I have an aunt who has passed away, and she named my mom and dad, and then if they were passed away, she named me and my brother.
As what? Beneficiaries?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, as it comes down, she didn't name one of the brothers. Can he sue or do anything?
The only person that has a right to inherit under Kansas law and the law of every state is a spouse. You can disinherit kids. They don't have a right to inherit a dime. But what you have is, it was just a mistake. They left. So that's why, you ever hear that you have to leave them at least $1? You ever heard that one? That's a myth. You don't have to leave them a dime. You just want to make sure that you know it's intentional that you left them out. I'm leaving out my son or daughter intentionally. I intentionally made no provision. That's all you have to say. You don't have to give them anything. Does that help you?
It's not in there as that. He's just not listed.
So I always put it in very clear. So I mean, no doubt, I left them out. And we're going to talk about family harmony and putting provision in your documents why you're doing what you're doing in just a little bit. But you want to make it clear. It was no mistake.
Yeah, because his name and my dad's name is the same.
Oh. Yeah, oh wow, oh wow.
My brother's has Junior after him, but still.
I don't think it prevailed because, I mean, the lawyer's going to probably say it was intentional that it was left out unless they got that off the internet and there's nobody to testify. But,
No, they're well about this.
you know, that's a lawyer after my own heart. 50 pages or so. That's my axiom. Your trust isn't worth, if I can say this, a damn, if it's not worth, it doesn't have at least 50 pages in it. So I'm joking about that, but usually it's going to be covering these what ifs we're talking about here if they happen. Like an insurance policy in a house, you cover these what ifs that can happen. What happens if this child predeceases? Who's it going to? What if it's going down to somebody who's 10 years of age? You can keep in trust till a certain age. Those kind of contingencies you can provide for, but you're not going to do that in 6 pages.
Yeah. So these people were very well off.
But I'm surprised they didn't say it was they intentionally left that name off, you know. Okay, so that's the downside of going out right. And you also have to think if you name the children on it like a house and beneficiary on every, even if they all survive, who's going to take care of your tax returns? Who's going to pay the bills? Who's going to handle personal effects in the house? I can tell you who's going to get the personal effects. The child that's got a truck and the keys to the house. We call that the pickup doctrine. That happens all the time. You probably have heard of that, haven't you? I was down to a client in Pittsburgh several years ago, and I was talking to my client. He said they had a funeral the week before. All the children but one went to the funeral. One of them went to the house and loaded everything. Okay.
We have services where one side of the family has to be seated on one side of the sanctuary, and the other half has to be seated on the other side, and you can't even walk them out of the aisle, out of the church together. They had to be in separate rooms for breathing. I mean, it's just
Sad, it's sad.
Yeah, it's a major deal. Yeah, it's real.
That stuff is real good for lawyers, as I said, not good for clients. So when your lawyer is telling you about things that basically preserve family harmony, it's against their financial interests, you got to listen to them, have experience. So that's what you have. You have no alternate beneficiaries. You got nobody taking care of the property. Nobody's paying the bills. Who's going to file the tax returns? You file it. No, I'm not going to file it. You got to appoint an administrator of the state so you can file a tax return. Now you got to go to probate to have somebody in charge of the affairs. So it's just usually not very. It's nice and simple, but that's where all the problem. People get these things off the internet, do it on the cheap. Let's just do beneficiary designations and hope everything works out. Well, often does not. So let me talk about the last thing is that you have is in terms of this issue, and that's family harmony. When a child serves a fiduciary of a parent's estate, they've got a conflict of interest. A lot of times it has nothing to do with the will or trust. It's how they were treated when they were 6 years old by their brother or sister. These grudges. And parents are just bad prognosticators of the harmony in their family. Our kids get along. Well, if they get along, you've got a lot more to lose if they don't. You've destroyed the whole family. So that's the way I put it. Now, I don't care. I really don't. But I've done this enough to know, and I've talked to enough lawyers, polled enough lawyers. I was out in Steamboat Springs, Colorado with a professor at Washburn about 3 years ago talking about this issue, estate planning for farmers and ranchers and dealing with family harmony issues. And I polled the audience. I said, what % of the time do you see significant family disharmony when a child is serving as a fiduciary, that's a trustee or executor of the estate, and there's more than one adult child? I said 0 to 25% of the time. 4 hands out of 71 lawyers and CPAs thought it was that low. 4, less than 25%. I said 25 to 50%. I couldn't count them. It looked like about 30 hands, though. Then I said over half. There were a few more over half than there were under half. I don't think it's that high. I think it's about 40 to 50% of the time is where it usually comes in. That was a little higher than most of them I see. But these are people that do this all the time. It happens all the time, frequency. And my deal with clients, that they've seen it happen in their own family with their parents, It doesn't take hardly anything, because I hear something like, well, I don't have enough to fight over. Oh, please. It doesn't take shoes. It could be anything. Jewelry. Mom promised me that. Personal property. We're going to talk about that a little bit too. But it's when you put them in there, there's just so many conflicts of interest. If you get on the internet and see that article, there's about 18 different things they can fight over. You say, isn't it clear in the document? Nothing's 100% clear in the document. You're going to sell a house? How much are you going to sell it for? Oh, my brother or sister didn't get enough for the property. Or my brother or sister took what happened to Dad's coin collection. I've had that one, something like that. They question what their brother or sister is doing. How about this one? When they let a sibling of the executor drive their mom or dad's car, boy, that really sets them off. It doesn't take hardly anything. And you have a child come in who knows nothing about this. They've never probably done an estate in their life. And some of them just wing it. They don't even ask for advice. They go out and do things, and they have no idea what they're doing, tax-wise or anything else. And I can tell you, their siblings are going to be very unforgiving for any mistake that they make. Very unforgiving. Or alleged mistake. And you know what? It would probably surprise you to find out that siblings expect their siblings to do this for nothing. Right? It's a family matter. No, it isn't. It's a legal matter. It's a financial matter. It just happens to involve family assets. It's not a family matter. So it's just, I hate to see that happen. I saw it happen so many times over my career. I didn't think about this until I was out in practice at least 15 years. I said, this ain't working. Look what's happening. They're all fighting. So I sat down with my partner, Stuart Weaver, when I went to Folston, and we drafted everything with family harmony being the #1 goal. You don't have fights and feuds. We have like mediation, arbitration, and talk about going outside the family. And people think that's going to be very expensive. Well, usually it's about 1% of the estate typically to have a third-party trustee, usually bank trustee maybe, or trust company, like Trust Company of Kansas maybe do it. How about lawyers? I think they are terrible trustees, including myself. We don't like to do it. You like to do jobs that you don't like? No, we don't. I don't like, it's like family law, fighting, feuding, calling me up on the phone, what my brother or sister's doing. No, I don't want to hear it. Click. Well, I'm not going to do that, but so you don't like to do it. You're not going to probably do the greatest job. You're going to put it off. Sometimes your clients are going to think you're covering up mistakes that you drafted in the same document you're now advising on. I've had that happen before. Assertions of you didn't do it correctly, or your mom or dad wanted something else and you didn't do it. I like to stay completely out of it. Name a third party as trustee and go out of it. And by the way, our fees, not surprised, are too high to manage an estate. We get several $100 fee an hour for doing estate sales. Are you kidding me? Or you call them up on the phone, here's a 30-minute phone call, and a couple $100 for the phone call. No. It's overbilling. So we have a rule in our firm, we don't do it unless there's some compelling reason to do it. Maybe you've got a client for 50 years, they just insist upon you doing it. But if we do, we'll probably have a corporate trustee and do most of the work and just stay out of it. But people think that it's save them a lot of money. It doesn't. Then we have fights and feuds. You're talking about mega bucks there. We just had a meeting this afternoon with one of those. It's going to probably run $25,000 to litigate one of the aspects of, because the sibling is the fiduciary. So it's just not, I think, a very good idea. And by the way, we don't have accountants and bookkeepers on staff. You know, most of our lawyers don't like accounting. We like legal stuff. So, but banks and trust companies, they have great records and they're bonded. Children are not bonded. If they're a mess, most people that draft these, they have a child, they waive any liability for a good faith decision unless it's a gross negligence for a child or anybody else. Well, that means they're basically immune from liability if they made a bad decision, taxes or something else. The other children have no recourse. Now, it keeps that child from being sued, but it certainly does not keep family harmony. They're still mad as heck that happened. So it's just, to me, it's like hiring a manager of a business who's had no experience at it before, and they're likely to have personality conflicts with employees. It's a fairly good parallel. So,
Question.
yes,
You have 3 daughters.
I only have 2.
Hypothetical.
Hypothetical, yeah.
House full of stuff.
Uh-huh.
How do you decide?
Who gets it? Okay, that's also on one of our things on the internet. Here's what the best way to do it. You can leave a list as to who you want certain property to go. Now, most people don't fill this out. That's a big mistake. But you start out hoping you can fill out a list. And what you do is you say, okay, I have certain things in my house. I want each of you to give me a list of what you would like to have, a priority, 1 through whatever. And a husband and wife, we're going to get together and decide kind of how you may not get the first one here, but hopefully you'll get something high as an alternate. And yeah, we're not going to share the list with your siblings. Nobody's going to know what we did with our final list and the list you gave. You don't want to have them all sit down and argue over who's getting what. That is just, you're just asking for it. So you start out with that. Now, there's things that nobody's on the list about. You can put a list whether you want it to come out of their share or not, because some of these things can be valuable. I had a client once, died. She had a Steinway piano. Probably, I don't know what those are worth today. I'm guessing about $25,000, a good one. And because if it's not on the list, you usually go through the house. Have you heard of this? 1, 2, 3, and then reverse it, 3, 2, 1. Some clients want to put stickies on stuff. I said, those are mobile. And move it to something else. That's what was going to happen. So you leave a written list. You want this to come out of their share of the rest of it or not? And so if someone, so you tell the fiduciary should come out and say, well, okay, here's the list. We distributed that. Now, the rest of this, we're going to draw straws typically. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, reverse the order, try to balance out a little bit. And well, I want you children to pick it based upon sentiment, not value. Because you'll see that your parents left in the document right for me to adjust for value if you get considerably more in value than somebody else, like a Steinway piano. You can adjust the share, they get that much less out of the rest of the estate if they do that. So pick it for sentiment. You want to keep it or use it, maybe recreational equipment, not to go off and sell it. And that helps you a little bit because that stops them from hopefully a little bit just looking for dollar value in what they're getting. And whatever's left after that, you can sell at estate sales and split the cash. Now some people say, oh no, what we'll do is give them money, play money basically. So you get so many dollars you could bid on every item. Not very good because they're all bidding against each other. You know, that's contentious. No. Just go through 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Does that help you a little bit?
Absolutely, thank you.
That can get it down to almost no controversy. And also you put in your documents, we're not paying for shipping or storage. I had a client, a daughter in Virginia wanted a refrigerator. You can imagine how that went over. And she wanted to ship. I get a call from the other beneficiaries, that she could buy one in Virginia for what it's going to cost to ship that. They were right. So you don't pay for shipping, you don't pay for storage. And I had another client, her daughter was in prison. She thought I'd be storage, so she got out. She had a rosy idea when she was getting out, by the way, but no, we're not paying for storage or shipping. If you don't pick it up, you got 45 days to pick it up or pay for shipping, or we'll sell it and send you a check for the net proceeds. That takes care of that really quickly. That only happened once. That Will Rogers thing about bad judgment, yeah, I only had that happen once, put in my document. We're not paying for that. Never happened again. May not have happened anyway, but I know it won't now. Yes?
So, my brother is single, and I'm the only one left with him.
Uh-huh.
And he has made me his beneficiary.
Uh-huh.
He recently split up from a longtime girlfriend. If something were to happen to him, can she go after me since I'm not a spouse?
No.
Okay. Good to know.
As a girlfriend, she's not entitled to inherit anything anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Great.
But it's,
That took a weight off my shoulders, thank you.
it took me a long time to come around to this, that all this bad experience, see these things blow up in your face, and people spend money for lawyer fees that they didn't have to spend for. So it was kind of an epiphany for me. It wasn't the road to Damascus, Pastor Susan. Probably I-70 maybe. This ain't working, I got to change. Yes?
If you have one executor, should you list the second and the third?
You should have alternates, yes. If you had a corporate trustee, you don't need to have a successor. They're not going to go out of business. But if you're going to name a third-party trustee like a bank or trust company, what you may want to do is to let the children, they have some input. Oh, what's the input? If they don't like that corporate trustee, they can fire that corporate trustee for any reason. We just don't like you. But they're going to have to go to another corporate trustee. So they have some input into that. And I will tell you, if they can be fired, they're probably going to be a little more attentive. That's just the way we are. So the children have some input, but they're not making those decisions that the other children can disagree with. And if you name a child and take that risk, and it's a risk, I don't care what the family is, but it's a risk, you can get that child have an out. And the out can say, basically, that child can resign and name a corporate trustee. Because what happens is you have like A, B, C. B isn't happy with A, so they make it life miserable, hope they're going to get off, resign, get it kicked off, and then they're going to be the trustee. No. You would go to the first meeting with the kids, the one that's named, and say, I didn't ask for this job, I didn't ask my mom, I didn't know about it. Usually I didn't even know about it, they just named me. I consider this to be a fiduciary relationship. It's not a badge of honor. I'm going to do the best job I can. I'm going to communicate with you, but I have to make the final decisions here. But you'll notice I want that in the document that I have the right to name a third-party trustee if things aren't going right, for any reason. So I want to know right now, is this a problem? If you're going to have a problem being I want to know right now, because that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to name a bank and resign. You know what the other kids are going to think? That's going to cost a fortune. I better be nice to my brother or sister. And they will, but that gives them an out if you're going to do that. Otherwise, I've seen that happen. They make life miserable hoping they're going to resign, or I'm going to get you kicked off, I'll take you to court and get you removed. That's not an option if they can just go to corporate trustee. And that first meeting, don't bring in-laws, ever. They are divisive. Nothing good is going to happen to have an in-law in there in the mix. They're not even family, you hear that. But a lot of kids will bring their spouses with them. Don't do that at that meeting. But even with children, you can have mediation, arbitration, you can have these provisions, and you can limit probably the possibility of those risks, but you're not going to get rid of it. There's still a high risk. I don't care who the child is. Yes?
What is the dollar amount you can give your children without being taxed?
100%.
What?
100%.
No, before death.
100%. See,
Only 50, like 11,000.
people get really confused about that. They get confused about this for Medicaid. They get about basic for income tax. Gifts are income tax free. There is no income tax. Section 102 of the code, you can look it up. Gifts are income tax free. So they're in the income tax. The question becomes, if your estate is big enough, you can have estate taxes, but that's huge. You have a $13 million federal estate tax exemption, about right. It's $12.92 million before anybody's subject to estate tax. Now, it's likely to go down in a few years, but it's still going to be pretty huge. It's going to be way beyond what most people have. So it's not a estate tax, and so if you don't pay estate tax on the estate before it goes to kids or anybody else, you don't have to worry about income tax because the gifts are income tax free. But if you give property away for Medicaid, you get a 5-year look back. And I don't care if it's within $17,000 for gift tax, it's still got a 5-year look back for a Medicaid. That has nothing to do with Medicaid, it's a gift tax. Because people that get more than $17,000, that's what it is this year, it's index for inflation. Yeah. $17,000 per person per year. But if they give more than that, there's no gift tax. What happens is it erodes what they have left for their estate. There'll still be no tax. It comes out of the estate tax exemption. So people get that confused all the time. Got that? Any questions about any of this? Yes?
So we are in Kansas, we put everything in trust here in Kansas, and we get called back to Scotland, where Steve is originally from. The trust won't travel with us, right? Can it cross?
It probably will.
Cross state lines and?
Yes, you cross the state lines very easily because every state recognizes trusts. Now, you may, if you go to another state, you may want to say, is there some state law I need to be concerned about in my trust to maybe change this? Maybe there's provisions that I can use in state law or need to do. People go to Florida, they've got a new house exemption, but you have to have a certain percent provision in your trust to get something like that. But it's not going to change much in your trust and who you're giving it to or anything else. And it's valid in every state. Let's go overseas then, okay? Scotland? Scotland is English, Kate. It's UK.
United Kingdom.
And that's common law. Our law is common law. It came from England. Trust came from England. They recognize trust. So it's probably good there, but again, I don't know what the laws that's going to affect. Maybe Scottish laws of some kind. I wouldn't worry about the trust being invalid probably. It's just you may have to make an amendment or two.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else about questions? Yes, ma'am.
A trust, can anybody change a trust?
It depends whether it's a revocable or irrevocable trust. I tend to use initials, IT for irrevocable trust and RT for revocable trust. If it's an RT, that means the person who set it up can change anything.
Okay, just the person who set it up, correct?
Yes.
Just the person who.
You'll see it sometimes referred to as grantor, sometimes as settlor, sometimes as trustor. That's the person who set it up.
Okay, so my mother-in-law set us all up for trust, but my sister-in-law has now taken over everything.
Is she how'd she get to be the trustee? Doctor's letters? Or she died? Not yet, so. The only way she would have any authority is as a trustee. If that's a bank account, the only one who can get access to that is the trustee. And you have to go to the bank and show them a certificate of trust that you are the trustee. And if you lied about that, that's felony. It's theft. Well, that's one happy family. Oh, by the way, when you name a child or something, how many of you remember The Far Side? I love The Far Side. Do you remember the one that had the 2 deer in the forest?
Yes.
Remember the one that rib cage of Target? Remember what the caption was? Bummer of a birthmark, Hal. And by the other deer. And I'd say that's what you do when you name a child. You just put a target on them, basically, is what you're doing. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to get hit, but there'd be a good target to shoot at. I was doing a seminar up in Kansas City, and I mentioned that. And one of the people in the audience had the T-shirt that had it on, sent it to me. I still have it. So I went to talk Wichita State Planning Council a couple years ago, and I brought it with me, that T-shirt. But that's what it is. It's just you're setting them up maybe to be a target. So it's just, yes, sir.
If you want to give certain things to someone before you die,
Uh-huh.
what do you do?
Are we talking about a titled asset or non-titled, like personal effects?
A title asset.
You have to change the title, sign over the title to whoever it's going to.
Okay.
If it's,
If you were
Oh, you mean your trust?
Yeah.
What you do is you want to get the assets you own in your individual name in the trust. Because if in your individual name and you pass away, that's probate. It's in the trust can dictate it. But if you leave assets in your own name, and that happens a lot, it's a probate asset. So what we typically do with those who do revocable trusts is you set up a trust and you have a document that says anything I own in my own name, I don't care what it is, bank accounts, whatever, real estate, I'm holding as trustee of my trust. I use it as a backup in case they forgot something. It usually works to avoid probate. It's in the trust. You take it to the bank. No, my husband had this bank account. He didn't get the trust, but here's a declaration of trust ownership. And that should work. Kansas law says you should be able to do that. But you don't rely on that, because then you've got to show it to everywhere. Now, no, you do retitle, but if you miss something, that's what you use. Okay? We said enough about trust and family harmony or disharmony, however you want to whatever you want to call it. Don't ever underestimate the risk of that. I mean, it is a big risk. But the point is, if you're going to give your children the right to discharge, I usually think let them all have to agree on that. If they're going to move it, wouldn't they all should agree before they go to another bank or something? They're going to incur some cost by doing that. It's not a majority, because the one that didn't want it moved is going to be mad because the others want to move it. But if either you all agree to move it or it stays right at the bank. I've had situations where, well, that trustee's favoring my sister, and they're like two brothers and a sister. They probably aren't. They didn't like the decision they made, and so they all should have to agree. Because if it's a majority, they move it, and it was for a bad reason. They just thought they were favoring somebody else. Third-party fiduciaries have no reason to favor anybody, except to make them mad. I mean, that's what's going to happen. So they're usually quite independent. But what you hear is this: they don't know the family. That's a plus. You don't have any family dynamics at all. Here's the trust. Here's who gets it. And they were going to make objective decisions. And if they mess up, they're liable. Yes, sir.
I got a question. If you have a bunch of stuff set up in a beneficiary for certain kids,
Uh-huh.
and say I die, then they go in there and get that, whatever I got set up. That can't be changed, can it? That can't be argued against if I got like a 401k set up under
A beneficiary designation?
designation. That can't be challenged or nothing, right?
The only thing they would be able to challenge that is they didn't think you had capacity when you did the designation in the first place, or undue influence. So if somebody starts getting dementia and they take them and get the beneficiary changed, for example, yeah, they can challenge that.
Okay.
But I mean, no, if you're competent to do it, no undue influence,
It's all,
they have
it's all
no.
on their attorney and everything, so.
Yeah, should work. But also the effect is, what trust can do also is, leave it in trust for your spouse. Leave it in trust for your kids. Depends on how much we're talking about. You wouldn't want to do that $50,000 or something, because if you leave in trust for a child, they're going to have to file a tax return for that every year. The cost of that may not be worth the asset protection for just $50,000. What do you think is the biggest cause of bankruptcy? Anybody? Medical bills. You got it. 550,000 bankruptcies a year are due to medical bills. And if you leave assets in trust for a spouse or leave in trust for a child, it's not subject to any, with certain provisions in it, it's not subject to any claim of any creditor, period. I had a client, she died, she left assets in trust for her son. He's his own trustee. This is what you could do, give him this much control and still have asset protection. He was his own trustee, he managed his own trust. He was the beneficiary, he could make distributions to himself, any of his descendants, for health, education, maintenance, support. That's about everything you'd ever need. You do whatever investments you want. And he also had a right at death to decide how it goes among his family. If he didn't change it, it's going to his kids, not his spouse. But he had the right, if he wanted to give it to his spouse by his will or trust. That much control. He goes into a hospital in Topeka, runs up a big medical bill. Either did not have enough insurance or none at all. Gets sued. They get a judgment against him, the hospital. I get a call from the attorney saying, the child was not my client, the mother was. I see you drafted this trust for such and such, and he left it in trust for the son. It's for his health, education, maintenance support. I'm going to go to court and get the judge to compel and make a distribution for his health. That's what it's for. He's not paying the bill. I said, you might want to check that statute before you do that. I knew because I drafted the statute. They had no claim, I didn't get a call back. I mean, you can't, no claim at all. A divorce, they can't get it either. The assets they leave in trust, they have no claim against it. But so most of my clients, they leave anything significant. If they do a trust, they keep in trust not only for the spouse, if they go to long-term care, to minimize spend down, but also for their kids. Let them be their own trustee. Now, if they're on drugs or something else, you're not going to be own trustee probably, but, or if they've got any kind of autism or something like that.
What you're saying basically, if you got a bunch of different type of legally stuff or money in different pots and all this, if it goes to all your kids, set it up under one trust for all your kids?
No, separate.
Separate?
Yeah, that's the recipe also for, if you can imagine, in one pot for everybody. I need it, no, I need
I mean, the trustee would be divided equally between the kids.
Yes, he would, but it's a separate trust for each of them, and they could be their own trustee.
Oh, okay.
So typically, they pay the bills, they divide up the estate. Of course, if the spouse survives, it's going to stay in trust for the spouse, where the spouse is the trustee. But if the spouse dies, then it's going to be divided in equal shares for each of the children. And if you want to, they could be their own trustee. They can discharge the trustee and take over their own separate trust. But it's all going to be set up by like a third-party trustee to get it ready to do that, knowing it's fully protected from every credit claim there is. And so we have a great statute, great laws, and stuff supported by our lawyers and our real property probate trust are just that. They're for clients. They're for clients. They're really client-oriented. Very good laws.
So if you have a great grandkid, for example, and you want to leave some money for them, but you don't want them to be able to get it until they're 21, you can set that up legally?
Now, you could do it for a lifetime. They're never their trustees. For the rest of their life, never be the trustee. If you want, you put any provisions you want. And a lot of times I'll put, okay, I want the children at a certain age, I want them to be a co-trustee, maybe at 30, and then 2 years after learning the ropes about trust, then they take over their trust. They've learned about trust, they learned about tax returns, and serving as a trustee for a couple of years with a bank or trust company as a co-trustee militates against the lottery syndrome. You heard that joke about, here, hold my beer, watch this. Anybody heard that one? I'll stay away from the expletives, but supposedly, hypothetically, they've got cars now, they can tell what people are saying before a fatal wreck.
Yeah.
In every state but Alabama, it was, oh, pick your expletive, you know, but Alabama, it was, here, hold my beer and watch this. So, but trust, the lottery syndrome takes place, obviously, they spend the money, and it's gone. So you can defer that till later, or clients have a lot of money, and sometimes they split 2 shares. Here's a share they take at age 30, the balance stays in trust maybe even to 60. They get the income off it at 60, they only get the other half when they're 60, so they have retirement. You know how very few people have enough money to retire at 62. And I had clients once that, well, they came in, they had kids, they were both in their 30s. I don't want to take much more time here because I know we want to let you go here, but I want to talk a little about powers of attorney, health care, that type of thing a little bit. I haven't got to that yet.
I think we're good, and I think everybody knows that if they need to leave, they can.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're happy to.
You can rate me by your feet, leave. So, but the key here is obviously that you have it set up like this so that you know everything's going through the trust and who it's going to. But a lot of people say it's good to tell the kids about the estate plan. Let me do that and we'll start talking about advanced directives, wills, trusts, living wills, powers of attorney.
I do have a question as we move into that area of power of attorney, and you're saying joint tenancy isn't a good idea on a bank account, but what do you do when you're the child and the only living parent is mentally incapacitated with dementia? How else do you make that work?
You mean the child's the next trustee?
There was no trust. We dissolved the trust when my dad passed away, but my mom had dementia, and so
She didn't have an estate plan at all,
We had a will, but that was it. You
which
know,
does nothing during lifetime, obviously.
um,
So no power of attorney?
Yeah, I had a.
That's what you do. You have a power of attorney. Somebody,
Power of
we'll talk about that in just a minute. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha, okay, that's what I was.
So that's how that works. But
Okay,
well, let's just go into powers of attorney: finances, health care, living wills. If you become mentally disabled and you can't manage your property, that's why you have usually at least a financial power of attorney. Somebody can manage your affairs for you. If you have a revocable trust, your spouse is usually the trustee. If you have a revocable trust, either spouse can sign on it. Anything in the trust, they don't need a power of attorney. They're already on there as trustee, and it only takes one signature. It's like a joint tenant account for everything between the spouses, but nobody else. But even that doesn't cover IRAs, because you can't put IRAs in a trust without cashing them in. They avoid probate because they're paid out to a beneficiary. So if a spouse is a beneficiary in an IRA, that doesn't help them during a lifetime because they can't pull it out as their beneficiary. It becomes theirs at death. So if they need to change the distribution pattern, change the investments, change the trustee of the IRA, the custodian, they can't do that as a trustee. That IRA is not in the trust. So they would have financial power of attorney to do anything that comes up outside the trust, like IRAs, tax returns. If you have a revocable trust, they do not file separate income tax returns because everything's taxed back to you that set it up under your Social Security number. There's no separate tax return while you're living, zero. So if you have a tax return, like a joint tax return, you would have to sign, if your spouse was disabled, under the power of attorney because it's not a trust tax return. Trustees can't do that. And any financial decision that comes up outside the trust, you'd have to use the power of attorney for. Lawsuits, that's another one that happened. Any kind of insurance claim, you'd have to use the power of attorney because the insurance policy is not in the trust. You're the beneficiary of it. If there's any kind of an accident, somebody has to pursue that on your behalf through the power of attorney. That avoids a conservatorship. Those are expensive. Usually run about $8,000 to set up. You've got to post bond. You've got to file out your accountings with the court. The worst situation I ever had was a client who didn't sign anything. We had it all set up. It kept postponing the time to sign the trust, the powers of attorney, et cetera. About the third time we had it set up and he called to cancel for some reason, I said, well, for whatever reason it appears you don't want to do it right now, I'm going to take you off our status report. You call me when you're ready to sign. So I sent a letter out to him to that effect, never heard from him again. But I heard from his wife about 8 years later. I got a call. They were selling a property out here in West Wichita. I don't know where it was here exactly. It was Cowskin Creek, though. And on Cowskin Creek, and between the time they signed it was joint tenancy, that they didn't even have a trust. It takes both signatures to sign. It's co-owned. So between the time of the contract and the day of the closing, he had an aneurysm, totally disabled. Couldn't sign anything. Did not even have a power of attorney. So the buyer says, did a damage estimate. Let me get a little further. We set up the conservatorship. We got her appointed, but then we had to find insurance policy. Spouses have to post bond. They can't waive bond on a conservatorship. And so we found the cheapest insurance company we could for the bond, but they're going to do background checks before they just issue the bond, but so she could go to the closing. Because the court would not give her articles of conservatorship till she posted the bond. There's Cowskin Creek. Halloween, 1998. Boom! Flooded this property out, about $50,000 worth of damage. So after she called, I said, nothing we can do. You can't go to close. They're not closing now. And the buyer was going to walk away unless they reduced the purchase price by their damage estimate was about $50,000. And I said, you can do your own damage estimate, but if it comes anywhere close to theirs, take it. I said, what's going to happen if you put this property up for sale again? It's been a flood, no insurance. So her estimate came close to that, so she reduced it by $50,000 and closed. Now she had to file his accounting for the rest of his life. Post bond, that was about $3,000 or $4,000 a year for the bond. File annual accountings to the court, and the court would ask a question: why are you spending money out of his joint tenancy account? What about your own money? You have an obligation to support your spouse. That's their job, to make sure you're not. People get mad about that, but that's why the bond would be even higher if you didn't have court supervision. So That's the worst scenario I ever had where somebody didn't do any planning. And just before we get to one last thing in powers of attorney, the worst thing you can have for Medicaid planning is a joint revocable trust. Either spouse can revoke it, one trust for both spouses. Here's the reason for it. All the assets in that trust, even a house or anything else, if it's in a trust, the state ignores those. Basically, if it's in a trust, you can pull it out, you own it. You have to still spend it down, even if it was exempt. It's not exempt if it's in a trust, period. And even if it was cash, the cash is going to be available to both spouses because either one could pull out the whole thing. But I see those all the time. So that's telling me somebody's got a joint trust, they don't have any concern about Medicaid or spend down, because that's what's going to happen. So let me get to the powers of attorney. Financial powers of attorney. It's not only to avoid a conservatorship, but if someone becomes disabled, a spouse, you probably, unless the second marriage, kids on both sides, which is the most complicated estate plan of all, you want to be able to move assets back and forth between spouses under a power of attorney. Gifting. Move assets over, I call it the well spouse. If you ever looked up this stuff on the internet, they call it the community spouse and the applicant. What's a community spouse? They're all in the community. So I call it infirm spouse and a well spouse. So the well spouse, you want to get all those assets usually over to the well spouse. Get the infirm spouse, it's got to get down to $2,000, right? That's what the number is. But you got to be able to transfer the assets. If that infirm spouse is incapacitated and you don't have a power of attorney, how are you going to move the assets over? You can't. You have to spend it all down. It's just like the joint trust. It's all going to count. You got to spend it all down. So you want to move it over to the well spouse. And by doing that, but the power of attorney has to do that. And if you got a house, you can't sell a house under a power of attorney unless the legal description's on there. I don't know if you knew that, but you can't. It requires a legal description. They're not going to approve the policy to sell that house. So you have, these people get on the internet, they don't have a legal place for a legal description, so they just get off the internet and sell everything. Well, it's not going to work on houses. And if it doesn't say you can't make gifts, you can't make gifts back and forth either. So the ability to move assets back and forth is key for Medicaid. While both spouses have capacity to have these documents set up, so in the event of capacity, they can act on behalf of their spouse through powers of attorney that are thorough. And so what we do, we put everything we can think of in a power of attorney, anything possible, pretty much. I thought I'd covered everything, but you never cover everything, you know, just waiting for something to happen. And this is about 5 years ago, and I had the power of attorney, and my client became disabled. Her daughter was the agent in the power of attorney, one child. You don't have any family disharmony there with one child, usually, unless they're schizophrenic or something. But anyway, she took that power of attorney and she wanted to forward the mail. Post office wouldn't take it. It didn't say you could forward the mail. Now, in Kansas law, it says all you need to say is I can do anything I can do, this agent can do on my behalf. Try to use that with federal government, Bank of America in North Carolina. They don't know what Kansas law is. So you say anything I can do, my spouse or the agent can do, but here's a list of about 5 or 6 pages of examples if you need something specific. Well, I didn't have the mail in there. I finally got him convinced to take it. I went back and put mail. Might as well cover FedEx, UPS, every commercial carrier. You get the picture? You can't be too thorough. If you need something specific, it's in there. Because if they aren't going to take it, what are you going to do? Go to a lawyer and pay for that? So you want to have it in stuff that's pretty unlikely. I guess that probably never would have happened again, but well, I know it won't happen now, with that being in the power of attorney. Any questions about that? Thorough powers of attorney, avoid conservatorships. Then you have health care powers of attorney. Be very complete there too. And my clients that go outside the family for the next trustee or the financial agent after a spouse do not usually go outside the family for health care. That's too personal. It's usually going to be a child for there to be on the health care power of attorney. I understand that. It's a risk, yes, that they put mom or dad in a cheap place so it costs them less money and they inherit more money. But you're not going to go outside the family. I wouldn't either. I'd take that risk in a minute. I could avoid risk of family squabbling on assets with going outside the family, and that's not an additional cost. But for health care, I would not want my children slighted, but they at least couldn't make health care decisions. But you want a comprehensive health care power of attorney as well. About everything you basically need to have. And these health care powers of attorney is usually best to be effective immediately. You don't have time to get 2 doctor's letters if you have to make a quick decision. So it's effective immediately, particularly for spouses. Financial, no. It can be effective immediately for spouses, just like a trustee either could sign. The power of attorney can be effective immediately for a spouse, but nobody else probably. Get doctor's letters if a child or somebody else is going to come on that, even a corporate trustee. They need to get doctor's letters. Financial decisions are not that hardly ever going to have to be real timely made. You got time to get the doctor's letters and get activated. So, healthcare, you want to be very comprehensive there as well. The last document is the living will. And all living wills are not the same. You want to have HIPAA releases, you get medical releases on those powers of attorney, not just making healthcare decisions, but medical releases from doctors and everyone else. Now, healthcare is almost always effective immediately. Why? You don't have time to get those doctor's letters. We're just alluding to that. You need to be effective immediately. You can use it. So, but doctor's records, HIPAA, all very complex, any medical decision possible. Yes, ma'am. Is your family getting along better now? No?
I got a better one.
Okay, all right, okay. Hit me with it.
Okay, my brother, I am now his medical.
Power of attorney. Uh-huh.
I don't want his financial power of attorney, correct? I mean, he's homeless, lives on the streets, but he had a stroke, and so now he's in a nursing home.
Okay. Well, does he have Social Security?
Yes, and they.
Are you the payee? Are you the payee on that?
Yes.
Okay, so you've got that covered. But any kind of insurance or anything else he might have, I mean, anything that would come up financially, except Social Security, you couldn't do if you didn't have financial power of attorney. But if you got involved in an accident, some kind of a claim, lawsuit, you can't handle that through a healthcare, but you'd have to use the financial power of attorney. So it's probably good to have it. It's probably pretty remote it's going to happen, right? But
Okay, so he's in a nursing home. He was in a nursing home, and he AMA'd out of that nursing home for this last month. And I have finally got him back into another nursing home with Medicaid and his Social Security. They take that, but they can't take anything of mine, right?
no. And if you're an agent of power of attorney, you're not liable for anything that you do as an agent. You sign on any doctor's appointment, you're not liable for that as an agent. The law does not make agents ever liable when they are acting for somebody else, and as long as you show you're signing as an agent.
Okay, so for them letting him AMA, shouldn't I have been told something about it?
What was it? AMA?
AMA, going and leaving the,
He signed himself out.
DNA, are you thinking? No, not DNA. You're AMA?
against medical advice.
He left.
He signed himself out.
Okay.
And he had a stroke, and his right side is not functional, and he's in a wheelchair. And they took him from the nursing home and put him up in a motel.
A medical advisor wasn't a healthcare power of attorney?
Me, but they,
Not them? I mean, they wouldn't have authority to do that.
well, they did.
I mean, you have to have a healthcare power of attorney to make any medical decision like that. There's nothing else that I know of that you can do it with. Okay?
So anyway, I've got him in another home now,
Uh-huh.
but the first home is still holding his money, his Social Security.
Is that direct deposit?
Uh-huh.
Is it still being direct deposit? Who's getting, they're getting the money out of that account?
Mhm.
He signed over that account to the home or something, they could draw on it automatically? Okay. But if you had a financial power of attorney, you could probably take that off, an automatic payee. You'd have, so it's usually always good to have at least a financial power of attorney for anything that doesn't involve health.
Okay.
So that avoids a guardianship. When you hear a guardianship, that's over the person, health care.
Yeah,
So-
they wanted me to do that, and I'm like, no.
No. So a guardianship's your only course of action if you don't have a health care power of attorney. And by the way, the health care power of attorney doesn't allow you to make decisions for them. If they can still make their own decisions if they're competent. You know, but if the healthcare power of attorney just authorizes someone to act on their behalf, but they always can act on their own behalf if they're competent. If they want to get out of a hospital or whatever, they can sign themselves out.
That's what they say.
And probably a lot of times they're not going to question their competency. That's not our rule. They sign it out. I'm not going to worry about it. Okay.
Because he told me 8 and 8 is 12, so, you know.
Wow. Well, you know, the competency to sign documents, and then we'll get to living will, is my last thing to talk about. By the way, all these mistakes we have in there, they kind of illustrate the things we were just talking about. I'm not going to go through all these slides, but you can read through them about there are other issues you have. But the living will provisions are designed to basically to cover situations when you don't want to any medical care in particular situations. I'm overriding the medical care power. In my situation, this is what I want to have happen. And I have clients come in and said, I need a DNR. No. Most people don't need a DNR. In fact, most clients don't need anything. That's a judgment call. I won't tell them what they need. It's up to them. But a DNR is usually for someone who has no quality of life left. I don't want to be resuscitated. I've got ALS. I've got a client right now, Huntington's disease. He wants a DNR right now. I mean, he's just starting to show symptoms, but he would not want to be revived for anything. He knows what he's facing. So, but if people have any quality of life left, they are not going to want a DNR. So, but about everybody would want to have a living will. The question is, what's the type? And most living wills, in fact, most living wills you get from lawyers, and myself included, for up to about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. If I'm terminally ill, no hope for improvement, I don't want to be any life support, I don't want any medical procedures just to unduly prolong my life. That's typically what it says. It's usually hospice. I don't want any medical procedures. Don't want dialysis, none of it. No cholesterol medicine, no blood pressure medicine. So that's when it kicks in. But I had clients that want to go beyond that to other situations. And one of them was the persistent vegetative state, permanent coma. Remember Terry Schiavo's situation in Florida? How many people remember that? What a mess that was. She was in a coma, I don't know how many years that was, like 8 maybe. It was a long number of years. Her husband wanted to terminate life support. Her parents did not. There was a big fight in court. He won the battle. They didn't have living will statute in Florida. You had to prove what she would have wanted. They established the court's sufficiency that she did not want to be in life support in that situation. So they terminated life support in that situation. But most clients would not want to be in that situation. You're not terminally ill. You could live for years in that state. So our statutes are not designed for persistent, and that's pretty rare though, especially with older people. It's not usually that situation. It's younger people usually get that some kind of a coma, whatever it is, but it can happen, and you could be it's pretty hard to say you're terminally ill to kick that in. But there's another one that's a lot more common than that we all face with our families and everybody else, and that has to do with Alzheimer's, dementia, brain injury, disease, Parkinson's. Someone gets to a place they don't recognize family or friends or know where they're located. Don't know where they're located, no sense of place. I want to be able to cover that too. So what I did was I got together with 2 doctors who were clients, 2 doctors who were not clients, Father Tom Welkers, the chaplain of Harry Hines Hospice here in Wichita, not from the religious side, the human side. What would you put in here? And he helped me write it. The doctors helped me with the medical side, and they helped me with terminology and lots of other things, so I expanded it. I think it's on the Kansas Bar Association site now. If anybody wants it, I'll give it to them. I give this free. I don't want to charge for that. I just put it together, but it goes through all those 3 different areas. Most people want all 3. They want just not terminally ill, but persistent vegetative state, permanent coma, and persistent so as well. Not everybody. One of the first clients I had after I did that was a doctor. She came in, and I was kind of going through what the living will might be and what you might want to have in there. She didn't have any specifics at that point. She said, okay, so I'm a type 1 diabetic. I'm on insulin, and I get in that condition. They're going to stop insulin? I said, yes. That's in there. So is dialysis is another one they would quit. It specifically lists those, including unlimited tube, but everything at least the doctors could tell me would be in those type of conditions. Heart medicine, any of that stuff, any medical procedures. But not everybody wants that. Did you all see Tony Bennett's deal the other night? I was amazed that he was doing it, the last concert at Madison Square Garden. Wow, that was just unbelievable. I mean, it was 2 years ago now. It didn't seem that long ago. He'd go through his routine with no mistakes. Amazing. Bantering with the audience. And he got off the stage, he didn't even know what he did. And he was out there singing. He said, then Lady Gaga was doing these, she's got a great voice too, got out on the stage with him. He says, ladies and gentlemen, Lady Gaga. When they got off the stage, that's the first time he's remembered my name in a year. I mean, but it's a different part of the brain that takes over when music starts going. And as you probably all know if you have people with dementia. That's something that always resonates. So it was, but if you don't get a place you don't recognize where you're at or sense of place, the doctors helped me. So I was going through this, she said, okay. I said, you're going to stop everything at that point. I thought she was going to say Hippocratic Oath, I don't want that. She said, that's what I want in that situation. So we've seen those situations. So it's for my clients, so what they do is they want that, and I have one that covers all three of those, not just terminal illness. So it's a very comprehensive, it's not easy, this stuff is not easy, but you want to be usually as comprehensive as possible, these what ifs that can happen, that you don't get blindsided by stuff you haven't planned for. To cover the what ifs. Well, I think I've taken up enough of your time, Pastor Susan, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll stick around for a bit if you got any questions.
If you have more questions, he'll stay. And you know, guys, another thing that most lawyers like Tim don't charge for like a consultation or
No, most
just
people
answering
are
some
safe
questions.
planning. Most people will do it if I could just tell them. Usually you can do
Yep.
a fixed fee once you know what they're going to do, because you don't know. People call them saying, what's a trust cost? Well, what's a car cost? You know,
Yeah.
you have no idea whether if they're
What
going to
you're
quote you
dealing
a fee
with.
off the phone, that tells you one thing. They've got a real simple form that doesn't cover a whole lot, you know.
Mm-hmm. And remember, we're talking about wills and trusts and DPOAs, because DPOAs are null and void upon the death of the person. That's why you need a will and a trust in place, because the DPOA is no longer valid upon the death of the person that you are the DPOA for. Also take note, if you're going to invest in a living will, you also might realize that there's something out there called a do not hospitalize order. Because we took my mom in for hip surgery, I got in the face of the surgeon and I said, if she goes on the table, you will not revive her. She has a DNR. And he says, I will revive her because the DNR comes off the operating table. And I said, so you're going to basically, you know, get her, crack her chest, get her going, plug her in, and make me pull the plug. And he goes, yes, ma'am, that's the way it works. And he turned away and he walked off. Be aware of what all these things are, because, and like Tim was saying, be aware of them now while you are cognizant. Because once something happens where your brain is not working right anymore,
Or your spouse, just one of you.
it becomes an absolute mess. And so that's why we do this. That's why we thank you, Tim. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.